now present For the Record.
Welcome to For the Record. I'm Will Keneally. We start this week in the state legislature, where lawmakers approved a series of election-related proposals. Now, the catch, some of them were bills, like one that the governor is expected to sign, which would allow municipalities to start processing absentee ballots the day before Election Day. But now, some of those proposals come in the form of constitutional amendments. Here's Representative Patrick Snyder speaking at a press conference earlier this week.
Basically, it requires that a photo ID be accompanied with the person voting with every election held in Wisconsin. You know, some of the folks say, well, we already have that in statute, but if you've noticed in the last several budgets of Governor Evers, it's been taken out of consideration. So this will keep it there. It'll also put it back into the hands of the voters.
Now, this is not uncommon for Republicans recently to use the constitutional amendment process to pass policies. That's the focus of a new Wisconsin Watch article, and joining us now is the author, Jack Kelly. And thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I know Wisconsin does it a little bit differently than the U.S. Constitution. Can you explain what that amendment process looks like?
Yeah, the amendment process here in Wisconsin is a little bit cumbersome. It involves passing a change to the Constitution in 2 consecutive legislative sessions, so in 2 separate but consecutive 2-year periods. And then it's put to voters as a referendum. So they'll weigh in directly on their ballot, yes or no, should this change be made. We had a couple of them on the April 23 ballot with the state Supreme Court race, and there could be several more coming in the next months and year.
So I understand some of these amendments could end up on our ballots that we could see in 2024. What are we looking at in terms of policy-wise?
Yeah, so the big ones stem from some election-related things. One of them is an amendment that would ban municipalities from using outside grant money or private donations to help pay for election administration. Another one would kind of further define what is a qualified elector here in Wisconsin. This amendment is kind of aimed at preventing municipalities from allowing non-citizens to vote in local elections. And so those are kind of the 2 big ones that are working their way through the process still. They are scheduled either to be on the ballot in April of 24 or in November of 24.
And so we're seeing these a lot recently. We saw some earlier this year, possibly some next year. Is this an often occurrence for Wisconsin voters to see these amendments hit their ballots?
Yeah, I would say that they're happening at greater frequency in the last few years than we saw maybe in the previous 20 years. Overall, Wisconsin voters have been asked to weigh in on amending the Constitution about 200 times since the state was formed. There was a peak of those, you know, going back several decades, and it's become less common now. In the last 20 years in Wisconsin, voters have been asked to weigh in on amending the Constitution 10 times, including those 2 in April. And, you know, we could see it 3 more times potentially next year. And there are also several, you know, constitutional amendments up for first consideration working our way through the legislature this session.
And so what does this look like on the voters' end? Who gets to set the language? Is it confusing at all when the voter reads that on their ballot?
Yeah, this is a really important question. Lawmakers write the question that appears on the ballot. And sometimes it can be vague and confusing. I mean, you could go back at the April 23 ballot and look at the questions which made changes to the state's bail system. But even beyond that, going back to 2020, the constitutional amendment known as Marcy's Law, there was a lawsuit that challenged the wording of the question, saying that this was too vague. It didn't adequately inform voters to make a decision about amending the Constitution. They were successful in that lawsuit in lower court, but it was eventually reversed, and the state Supreme Court did rule it adequately informed voters. But it was a lawsuit that made it all the way to the state Supreme Court, and just shows that sometimes these questions can be vague, and when you're trying to make these sweeping changes, boiling it down into, you know, 2 or 3 sentences on a ballot can be pretty complicated.
So I know, excuse me, the legislature would certainly like to think that they've got their finger on the pulse of Wisconsin voters, but sometimes these get shot down, right? Have we seen any of that happen recently?
The most recent one to be shot down was back, I believe, in 2018, which was an amendment that would have abolished the state treasurer's office. That amendment failed, and that was the most recent one. Of the 10 most recent amendments, 9 of the 10 have been successful. Historically speaking, about 25% of them have failed. They've been asked, voters have been asked to ratify, to either approve or reject an amendment, like I said, about 200 times. I think they've approved about 140 or 150 of them. So it comes in at a rate of about 75% approval, 25% disapproval.
So I understand too, this is kind of that small d democratic. We don't have like ballot referenda usually for bills here in Wisconsin. It's one of the ways that voters can weigh in. But it also comes at a time where we see the state Supreme Court flip for the liberals. Now liberals and Democrats kind of control two levers of power in state government. Are we seeing these more recently kind of in that context of how power is shaking up here in Wisconsin?
We certainly are. I think if you look at the nature of the amendments that are moving their way through the legislative process and could potentially be posed to voters, you have some things that stem directly from legislation that's been vetoed by Governor Tony Evers. We're seeing that with this ban on using private dollars or private grant money to administer elections. That came from a bill that the governor vetoed. Also codifying existing conservative policy victories. The state's voter ID law. Obviously there was tons of litigation about that going back 8, 9 years now. But that is something that Republicans would like to write into the state constitution. And if you look at what the amendment's author says about it, he says, I don't know if the Wisconsin Supreme Court will uphold voter ID, but I'm not willing to take the chance. And the only way to protect it is to put it into the Constitution. You see it with other things, an amendment that would require a 2/3 majority to enact a tax increase. I think Republican lawmakers would probably tell you taxes are still too high in Wisconsin, but they have made progress in cutting taxes over the last couple of budget cycles, and I think that they would see this as a way to lock that in. So, I think these amendments are all about power. That's kind of the through line of all things in Wisconsin politics, it'll be interesting to see how they play out, and certainly we'll be interested to see how voters decide to vote on them.
Well, we'll stay tuned, and we'll catch your reporting at wisconsinwatch.org. Jack Kelly, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.